I'm Kathryn Arndt, the Chief of the VLGA Connect Studio. Welcome to today's episode, brought to you by the VLGA, your counsellor support network and the national broadcaster on all things local government.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the latest global live panel from the VLGA. My name is Chris Eddy, and I'm your host for today's discussion on the changing nature of elections. Firstly, on behalf of the VLGA, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Victoria and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay our respects to the traditional owners, their elders past, present and future, and to their cultures. Thank you for joining us today for this important discussion. With local government elections coming up in October in Victoria, how will the advancements in technology and the rise of misinformation online impact the democratic process? While technology aims to simplify our lives, the advancements in AI technology and the rise of information is making it difficult to know what is real and what is not. And around the world, administrations, elected officials and candidates are grappling with the challenge of managing misinformation and disinformation across various platforms. We've seen this play out on an international stage in a number of ways in very recent days. Our panel today will discuss how we can balance free speech while ensuring integrity in our electoral process. Now, unfortunately, Kathryn Arndt cannot be with us today, the CEO of the Victorian Local Governance Association. She's been called away, but I would like to just say a few words on her behalf about the VLGA, which supports councils and councillors to deliver great outcomes for their local communities through high performance and good governance. We're member-run and non-partisan. The VLGA aims to provide practical advice, direct support, training, professional development, events, networks and resources to members and carry out research, policy analysis and advocacy on behalf of local councils. It's the leading voice for local councils and offers members the opportunity to realise their true potential leadership options and to increase their impact, with a mission of inspiring and enabling good governance in councils. So throughout today's session, please feel free to add any questions for our presenters in the Q&A box, and we'll endeavour to get to them throughout our presentation or in our dedicated Q&A component at the end with the time that we have available. The chat function is open for any commentary or discussion between members during the course of the panel, and this webinar is being recorded and will be made available to all those who've registered in the days after the event. That's the housekeeping done. Let's introduce you to our panellists who are joining us today. Firstly, we'll be joined by Dr. Andrea Carson, a professor in the Department of Politics, Media and Philosophy at LaTrobe University. Andrea examines the news media's role in politics. She researches media trust, political communication, digital campaigning and elections, digital platform regulation and media business models. And she does comparative work on the regulatory environments of digital platforms and mitigation measures to tackle mis- and disinformation. Then we'll speak with Ian McCormack, the president of Strategic Steps Incorporated in Canada. Ian has a broad range of experience, including working in government, for-profit and non-profit areas. He's worked across Canada and beyond in recent years with a focus on local government, ethics, libraries, post-secondary education and non-profit organisations. And his third book, Uncivil Society, about abuse in the local government realm, will be published later this year. And finally, we'll chat with Sven Bluemmel, the Victorian Electoral Commissioner since last year. Sven has served as the inaugural Victorian Information Commissioner, the Western Australian Information Commissioner, and has held senior positions in the Western Australian and Commonwealth public sectors. He practiced law in the private sector in Melbourne and Perth in the areas of information and privacy law. And we really appreciate Sven being with us today because, as you know, elections are just on our doorstep in Victoria, so it's a very busy time for him as well. So that's our panel that we have to look forward to today. We'll take those slides down. You can see everyone now, and let's get into the discussion. And I want to firstly bring in Dr. Andrea Carson to talk about, as we lead into this election cycle, what we expect to see in terms of how people are getting their information. Andrea, hello and welcome.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for that warm introduction. And thank you to my fellow panelists, a very distinguished group that I'm lucky enough to join, and also to the VLGA for hosting. The information environment, and I deliberately use that terminology because we once talked about the media ecosystem, but now it's been expanding, and it's a very complex hybrid system where people get information both online and offline. And increasingly, as the latest digital news report, which samples public opinion across 47 countries, has shown us, increasingly people are getting their news in the online environment. And younger people in particular are getting news from social media. So with the Victorian elections just a couple of months away, and the New South Wales one's local government elections next month, we can expect to see that people will be getting their information from multiple sources across different digital platforms. And interestingly, things like Facebook, Instagram, they're now called legacy social media sites. That there's a raft of new social media sites that have come in, and TikTok and YouTube in particular are really gaining their prominence in where people are getting information from. And we saw some of this with the Voice to Parliament referendum that was held in Australia in 2023, and some work that I did with colleagues where we produced a report on that showed that very adept campaigners understand this changed, ever-expanding information environment, and they will be campaigning right across the different platforms, as well as with traditional media sources. And being local government elections, they'll also be running out messages in very local media. So it's a mixed environment, and we see that contrary to past ideas that people stay in echo chambers, that there is an intermingling of information from both the online sphere and the offline sphere, and that people tend to have varied news diets.
So, Andrea, when people see this information from all these various sources, do they actually generally stop to think about whether where the information's coming from, whether it's trustworthy, whether they can believe it or not?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's a tough one to answer because it obviously depends on people's degree of media and digital literacy, and also what types of information they're consuming. But what we do know is that in this vast information environment, that there's high quality information and there's low quality information, and trying to sift through that can be pretty tricky. Again, the digital news report, which focuses on the different countries that are in that study, and Australia is profiled there. We know that 75% of Australians are concerned about encountering misinformation and trying to work out what is real from what is fiction. There are some indicators that we can use that help us navigate that space, such as quality news brands. But some consumers of news, or some people, they don't take much notice when they're looking at information online about which outlet it's come from, whether it's from The Guardian or whether it's from the Herald Sun or whatever the brand might be. So I think there's a role there for quality media outlets to really highlight their brands and to be able to differentiate from some of the low quality information that's in the news space. The other factor I think that is important here is that there are a few tools to be able to navigate this space, including third-party fact checkers. And we've got a range of those in Australia, AAP being one of them, RMIT Fact Labs being another, which regularly fact check erroneous statements and are able to call out disinformation campaigns as they seed. But it is a difficult and a complex problem that does trouble Australians.
I guess the challenge is it's great to have those organisations doing the fact checking, but it must be difficult to get the fact checking out there in the same way that the original mis or disinformation was distributed.
That's right. It's difficult to just do a one-off fact check and then forget about it. Misinformation often gets repeated. And so therefore the negation of misinformation also needs to be repeated. And once false information does go out across mainstream media or social media, and both are responsible for this at various times, the correction doesn't always go out across the same channels. So you don't know that those that have seen the misinformation are also seeing the correction to that misinformation. So it's incumbent upon a range of stakeholders in society. We can only address this with a whole of society approach to be able to counter some of those mis and disinformation claims. And by stakeholders, I mean, we're talking about politicians that have a responsibility to put responsible speech into the public sphere and to negate false claims, as well as academics like myself to research it, the big tech companies to wind down the algorithm or to withdraw false claims that can cause harm. As well as civil society plays a really important role here because they're often at the front line to be able to identify when a disinformation campaign is taking off. And they often have the trust of more vulnerable groups and are able to disarm them or disabuse them of the false claims. So this is, and the other stakeholder, of course, is professional journalists that have a responsibility to be able to call out where there has been something that's been falsely reported and not to perpetuate or amplify that false claim and make it worse. I would add that in the Voice to Parliament, we did also see the weaponisation at various times of the terms of mis and disinformation, where sometimes when people have different points of view, they might label it as misinformation when in fact it's just an unsavoury point of view. So all of us have a responsibility to not share things we know to be wrong, and also not to misuse those terminologies which weaken their impact. I would invite Ian and Sven, if they've also got a comment to add about the way that they see the circulation of mis and disinformation online and what they might see the role of organisations like the VEC in countering that.
Yeah, I mean, Andrea, I was struck by when you mentioned the weaponization of the term of mis and disinformation. It's a bit like the term fake news, which is being used in a way that deviated quite a long way from, I think, what it was originally intended to mean. But Andrea, when you mentioned there the role of fact-checking organizations, I mean, we had I think, post-referendum last year when the partnership between RMIT Fact Check and the ABC was wound down. I think there was some misrepresentation about whether that was resulting or what actually precipitated that. Is that something that you were across? Because I think one of the issues there also was that participants were sort of stepping back and saying, well, yes, the fact check has to be independent, but does that actually mean that they need to find equally for both sides of an argument and so on, which I think is not necessarily the case.
Yeah, that's something that I've looked at, particularly during the Voice to Parliament referendum, where America's had fact-checking organisations for much longer than Australia. And I often find that we tend to be one or two cycles behind the American experience. And the first fact-checkers there in 2003, I think, and increasingly over time, they've become politicised, where various groups will identify with one fact checker as being, say, more liberal than another. And in Australia, we're starting to see some of that politicisation of fact checkers occurring here. And there was an unfortunate attack on RMIT Fact Labs during the Voice to Parliament, where it was accused of taking a specific side in the referendum by Sky News. And we did some survey work around that time to see what people's evaluations were of different fact checkers, and found that some of that news reporting had a real impact on people's trust in the actual fact checker. So I think there's a responsibility there that we try and preserve the independence of the fact checkers and also not bring them into the politicisation or weaponisation that can embroil these false narratives.
If I may, too, just taking the lead from some of what Chris had written. Welcome back, Chris. What Chris had written too about the effect of what you're seeing in terms of misinformation and disinformation on either how sitting members are responding to inquiries that may be coming, whether they're providing information that requires fact checking, or whether it is believed. And finally, what does this do to candidates as well, in terms of people who may be choosing to seek office or choosing not to, depending on what they're seeing out there in the broader environment?
Thank you. My apologies, everyone. I lost internet, but I'm back, and I've got no idea where you've gone with the conversation, but I'm sure it's been very useful and interesting for the audience. Andrea, what I was building up to asking you was whether there's an accepted definition of misinformation as opposed to disinformation. I've always assumed that misinformation might not necessarily be intentional, whereas disinformation is that putting too fine a point on it?
No, I don't think so, Chris, but you do raise an important point, and that is that there aren't universal definitions that are universally accepted across the various groups that spend a lot of time thinking about this, which is the digital platforms, journalists and academics, that there can be some variation in the way that mis and disinformation labels are applied. And Sven raised this by talking about fake news just a moment ago. This can be problematic because it means that when we're taking an approach to countering mis and disinformation, we're not always at the same starting point. And I think having universal definitions is really helpful. So in my work, the way that I apply these terms is that misinformation are falsehoods that can spread and do spread. And sometimes people who are spreading them don't realize that they're spreading false information. Disinformation is probably a subset of that, which is where it's the purposeful spread of misinformation with two objectives. One is either to cause harm to someone else or to cause advantage, such as political advantage. So disinformation, many will say it's with intent. I think it's hard to necessarily divine what someone's intent is, but we can see what intent is through actions. And that's why I use the terminology of purposeful. Fake news sometimes is used as a fairly vague umbrella term for both mis and disinformation, or it can be falsehoods that replicate the format of news reporting in order to mislead the public. So they're kind of the broad definitions that are applied here, but happy to bring in the other speakers if they see it differently.
All right. So just before we let you have a rest, Andrea, you just mentioned, the potential for that to being used to create political advantage for someone, or I guess a disadvantage for someone in the same context. What's your advice to sitting members, potential candidates as we move into an election period about being on the alert and being able to combat this misinformation?
Well, one of the harder edges, I suppose, to misinformation is that it can cause real world harm, and it can be very hurtful content in the form of incivility. And I know this is an area of expertise for Ian, so I'll let him elaborate on it. But what I will say is that through some of the work that I've been fortunate to be able to do in partnership with the VLGA, is that we've been able to look at what incivility looks like in local government. And we find that both men and women candidates and councillors encounter similar levels of incivility, but the difference that we find is that it tends to be more gendered when it's targeting women than what it is for men. We find the greatest perpetrators of incivility are the general public, but really closely followed by fellow councillors, which is worrying. And it speaks to, I think, lack of recourse for councillors when they're encountering that incivility. And we also know that those that are disproportionately targeted are often from diverse groups such as GTBTI and CALD status, and also from younger women that often under the age of 40 that again encountered that gendered abuse. So I think we can talk about what some of the range of mechanisms might be to counter that, but unfortunately, social media is a real two-edged sword for councillors and for candidates, because it's a terrific tool for campaigning, and we saw much of that during COVID, where people weren't able to move around freely, especially women that were at home predominantly, looking after, running the house, looking after children at home, as well as doing their jobs, are able to campaign online. But the negative side of that is it also provides greater access for people to be able to reach them online, and for them to encounter more incivility. And so perhaps one of the avenues we might discuss further down the track is about universal code of conduct and other mechanisms to improve the behaviour of councillors to each other.
All right, thanks, Andrea. And we might just remind the audience to pop your questions in the Q&A or comments in the chat if there's any particular issues being raised here that you'd like to make sure we delve into a little more deeply before the end of the session today. I might bring in Ian for the conversation now. I'm going to jump to that issue of incivility, Ian, that Andrea's introduced there, because you've literally written a book about this that's coming up later this year. Why have you chosen that topic particularly at this point in time?
You know, it's this is the third book I've written, and this is the first time I felt almost a compulsion to write rather than a desire to write. That the first books I had written were truth, beauty, goodness, all those sort of things, attributes of why people might get involved in local government. But this was a case of having experienced many people across many parts of Canada and beyond who are running into this matrix of abuse, where people are either choosing not to run for office, or choosing to resign or not re-up after one term, or for some other reason are resigning partway through their commitment. And what that's meaning is we are losing, first of all, for the second two groups of people who are already elected, we kind of have an idea about what we're losing. And Andrea talked about some of the types of people who we are losing. And my take is I would like my local council to represent the depth and breadth of my community, whatever the demographics happen to be. But we're losing a big chunk of that because some people are self-selecting out. The insidious part to me is those people who choose not to run, because we don't know who those people are. And we don't know what we have lost or what we may be losing from that. And so I think it's particularly insidious. So the book came about because of all the stories that I had been hearing from various people in various places. And it does set up into a matrix to me. The exploration that I did looked at abuse in so much as it involved the political people. So it was abuse or incivility associated with things like stalking or gaslighting or social media posts or any of those sorts of things. The council to council was probably perhaps the biggest one, but I also was council member to council member. But I was also looking at members of the public, voters, non-voters, again, are abusing elected officials. They're also abusing members of administration as well. Councillors are abusing one another, but they're also abusing members of administration. The only group that I didn't really look at in terms of this matrix of abuse was administrators abusing administrators. I'm sure it happens, but to me, that's more about workplace health and safety than it is specifically around the incivility we're looking at in terms of local government. And it's getting to, Andrea's mentioned it too, it's becoming more and more prominent. It's becoming a greater and greater factor in people's decisions either to run for office, to re-up to office, or not running for office as well, and for a variety of reasons. What I have heard thus far and in other interactions in the United States and in Australia is very similar to our experience in Canada, which is quite sad, really, because what it tells me that this is transnational. The borders really don't matter. And when we're seeing media, we've already made reference to, for us anyway, what happens south of our border in the United States. But it's going on around the world too. And people who I've interviewed in many Western democracies, and maybe I'll just leave it at Western democracies, the issues seem to be very similar. The types of abuse seem to be very similar. The pain that they are causing, the loss that they are causing are all very similar as well. So this isn't something that is unique to Australia. It's not something that's unique to Canada either. Part of it, I mostly looked at constitutional monarchies, basically just because that's my experience. But So a lot of things that Andrea said, and I'm sure Sven would say as well, are fairly consistent right across the board. And it's the reason I felt compelled to write this book, because I wanted to talk a little bit about what the problem is, why it's getting worse, and what the heck are we going to do about it, which is kind of the second half of the book.
I noticed just recently, Ian, a council over there, I think it was Whitehorse City Council in Canada, adopted a code of civility. Is that a sign that this issue is being taken more seriously now?
Yeah, and I'm sure it's the same with you too, that because this is quasi-judicial in terms of local government, they hold paramountcy in their chambers. So mayors could conceivably call a recess or adjourn a meeting if the abuse or incivility is happening during that time. And that's what the city of Whitehorse, which is the capital city of one of our northern territories, has done. And in this case, they have essentially laid out the rules in advance. They said, thou shalt behave in such and such a fashion. And if you don't, these are the sanctions that we are going to exert on you. So while Whitehorse has done this, other communities of various sizes throughout the country have faced similar issues and have managed them through existing legislation, bylaws, policies, those sorts of things. What Whitehorse has done is actually just brought the pieces together into a standalone piece of legislation. It's sad that it's necessary. I think it's a really good idea. And I think it puts people on notice that we are not going to tolerate the kind of behavior that has become organically more prominent in the work of our legislators.
So as Councillor Munro in the audience points out, we're talking about Whitehorse in Canada, not Whitehorse in Melbourne. But I'm wondering what you think, and perhaps what Andrea thinks about if more of this were to happen, more of these the signals being sent by institutions that we're going to have this code, we're not going to tolerate this. Would more people then feel comfortable about putting their hand up for elected office? Because as Ian, you say, there's a real trend of some just not even considering it because of these behaviours.
Yeah. It's cultural after a while. So insofar as it's taken us time to get to this place in our culture, it is also going to take us some time to get away from this place in our culture. So just having the rules in place is one thing, but actually administering the rules, enforcing the rules is sometimes quite different. And until that actually happens, the zero tolerance for abuse in all its forms begins to take root. I don't know that those people are the people who we want to sit on our local councils, and probably in our other orders of government too, are the ones who are going to come forward. And if it was me and I was putting my family through the potential of this sort of an abusive situation, it's not worth it. And so I may choose not to do anything about it. So it's going to take some time to get out of the same problem we got ourselves into. And we are becoming more and more interconnected society. The definition, say, for example, for the most part anyway, my definition of community has changed from one of geography, me and my neighbors, to one of interest. That it might be, I'm a glider pilot. So it's other glider pilots around the country who all speak in gliderese and we understand one another, and we're a community. But to me, those are the types of things that we see in communities. And when you start to bring some of those like people together to talk about politics, local government, or other orders of government, we're starting to see something that I've started to call the coffee shop Senate. And that's the group of people who gather together at the coffee shop on Tuesday afternoons and talk about common sense. And what they mean by common sense is people who agree with me or people who think like I do. And those are the types of people then who are able to justify somehow the type of behavior that the rest of society would abhor and would not have been tolerated by anybody, say, a generation ago. But gradually that water is warming. The frog doesn't know it's being boiled, but at some point it's going to die.
Andrea, I just wonder whether you have a comment on particularly that codifying issue, whether it's part of a solution for people to feel more comfortable putting their hand up for elected office at the local level.
Well, first of all, I'm going to buy Ian's book because he speaks a lot of sense. I think having universal minimum codes is a first step. And I see that there's been movement on that last week with a draft code of conduct in local government across the 79 municipalities. But it's not just councillor to councillor, as Ian has pointed out, that are the perpetrators of incivility. It's also the public. And that makes it a little more difficult. I know through our research interviewing councillors that some have even gone to the police with the level of abuse that they've received. And I think there's a role there also. Sometimes those claims have been dismissed as being part of the rough and tumble of politics. So I think there's a role there for some education as well, not just of our police, but also appeals that go to VCAT, to the judicial officers, that this shouldn't be accepted as being part of the rough and tumble of politics, that these are serious problems. And they're serious for, two really big reasons come to mind. Ian's already pointed out the importance of having diverse representation. And in Victoria specifically, we've got a target of gender parity by 2025. And Victoria's been doing really well on that, now at 43.8% women compared to men. And in October, we've got an opportunity to bring that up and reach that target to gender parity by 2025, being the last election opportunity. And there's a myriad of women that are prepared to put their hand up and go into local government, but there's also an attrition rate for the reasons that Ian's pointed out. And we're not going to achieve as a society gender parity if women are getting in there for really positive, idealistic reasons to make their communities better, and then find that they're subject to this abuse. Although it's remunerated, it's compensated, it's pretty much an extended volunteer role in many ways. People do far more hours than what they're compensated for. And we don't want to dissuade those people who want to take collective action for the good of their communities not to be participating. So one of the reasons I'm keen to read Ian's book is he suggests the second half does contain some answers about how we can tackle this. But I think it is a problem that has to be solved with collaboration across stakeholders and a multi-pronged approach. And that involves the tech companies dealing with harmful content, also with media not amplifying this content, councils having appropriate codes of conduct and enforcing them, and a broad education campaign about what's acceptable, what's not, how to use digital tools, and what not to do.
Thanks, Andrea. Some comments and questions coming in the chat. We'll get to these very shortly, and I want to bring Sven into the conversation in just a moment. But if I can just quickly go back to Ian. So Andrea's mentioned this new model code of conduct that's currently out for consultation in Victoria. Councils have had to have a code of conduct for some time. What needs to be in that code of conduct is becoming a little bit more prescriptive, I guess you could say, at the moment. I understand in Canada, it's not universal that councils have to have codes of these types, Ian?
That's correct. Like you, under the Canadian Constitution, our provinces and territories control local government. They call them creatures of the federal, creatures of the province, local governments are. So it means it's a little bit different coast to coast to coast. But what we've seen in some places, where I live here in Alberta, for example, a term or two ago, our provincial government brought in a requirement for mandatory code of conduct bylaws. So they had some teeth to them. And they actually created, they're actually in three parts, anyway, the best of them. The first is, what is the kind of conduct that we are looking for from our elected officials? The second is, what would constitute a breach of our code of good conduct, whether it is actions that these elected officials are taking within the context of a council meeting or chambers and whatnot, or whether it's out in the broader community. And the third piece, actually there's more pieces that I thought of. The third and fourth pieces are about complaint mechanisms. First of all, an informal complaint mechanism, but how do we resolve the small stuff easily without taking up a whole lot of time? The next is then the formal complaint mechanism, about if something more egregious has happened, how do we actually get somebody involved to have a look at it? And actually, I've taken on that role in a few municipalities as their integrity commissioner, which is what they called it. And then the last part then is, if it's up to council eventually to decide whether there has been a breach of this code of conduct or not. So that becomes a bit of a binary decision. Council is looking at itself and saying yes, no. If there is some sort of a breach, then there are a series of sanctions that can be applied. And Andrea made the point that it's necessary to apply these things fairly and equitably, but to apply them. Because if there's no application of whatever the requirement is, then that law really doesn't exist in the first place. So just a note that these things are mandatory in some places, not mandatory in others. Sometimes they bring in external parties such as myself, and sometimes they handle things internally. This doesn't preclude the courts getting involved, of course, that there is another order of government above local government, two orders in fact, that can, if there are contradictions or contraventions, legislative paramountcy would say that the federal, or in our case, the provincial governments, certainly do have the ability to have some sort of an impact on the extreme cases of bad behavior.
We've certainly seen some court action around some conduct decisions here in Victoria in recent times as well. Thank you, Ian. Sven, thank you for being patient. I want to bring you into the conversation. How does all of this make you feel about how the VEC needs to manage this upcoming election? Is it something you need to take into account?
Oh yeah, it certainly is. I mean, on the one hand, how does it make me feel? I mean, on the one hand, it's a little bit depressing and it's a little bit overwhelming, but on the other hand, it's the sort of stuff that we at the VEC have been looking at for years and years and years. Now, of course, it keeps evolving, the threat keeps evolving, the threat keeps changing, the channels through which it's done and the language that's used changes. But ultimately, the idea of mis and disinformation itself as a concept is not new. I mean, I think it was Charles II in the 1600s who I think ordered or tried to order the closure of coffee shops because of what he argued was, well, using today's terminology, he would have called it fake news. So those sorts of things are not new, but of course we have to keep evolving because the threat keeps evolving. Probably the single biggest change from, say, 2 years ago is how much more easily one can get hold of generative AI. And how that's going to be used and indeed certainly misused. We've seen that in some elections around the world. Recently, we haven't seen much in Australia yet. We've seen bits of it, but not sort of concerted campaigns, whereas we have overseas, including in some of our sort of neighboring countries like Indonesia. So we're always doing this. What we always have to be cognizant as the electoral management body is what is our valid space to be playing in to meet this, and what is beyond that. So, for example, when there's a contest of ideas between candidates about policies, about each other's character, dare I say, and I note that we've got a question on that issue, then that's generally outside our remit as the VEC, because we have to be the independent umpire. We deliver the election. We have to be impartial, and we don't wade, and we shouldn't wade into policy debates between candidates. On the other hand, if there's mis and disinformation about the electoral process, so for example, who's entitled to vote, how one goes about casting a valid vote, the date when things are due. When there's mis and disinformation around that, we see that as very much being squarely within our responsibility. And we certainly take a lot of action in that regard. We've got a whole suite of effort that we undertake in that regard. But it is constant, especially as we get close to an election. And we just have to be constantly vigilant in that regard. We are, but the threat keeps evolving, and with it, so we have to evolve as well.
How has your planning for this coming electoral cycle differed, if at all, from previous election cycles, given all this misinformation, the civility issue that's perhaps more ever present than before?
Yeah, let me give one sort of very practical example. For us to run a local government election, which is what we're just about to, or we are doing now, our workforce grows temporarily to in the order of about 5,000 staff, and to run a state election, we grow to over 20,000 staff. Now, every single one of those people has a right to safety, has a right to a safe workplace, and we work very hard to be able to provide that, and we're generally very, very successful in doing that. One of the things that we sort of saw for the first time about 2 years ago in the state election is that sort of targeting of VEC staff, either ongoing VEC staff or our temporary election workforce. So one of the things that we've invested very heavily in over the last sort of 6 to 12 months is that safety at work. recognizing the potential for harm. So the practical example I'll give is that two things is one, we have all of the physical, even though it is a postal election, all of the physical offices that we use for this, we still have 78 election offices that we run for nominations and so on. They have to be staffed, etc. And one of the things that we're doing now, much more than we did before, is we actually do a security audit of those to make sure that the physical environment there allows us to keep our staff safe, not just from risks like fire and so on, but of course we do that, but also from that sort of incivility, intimidation, threats, and worse. So we have to do that. The second thing I want to mention is what we do in this space is a lot more training for our workforce and giving them the tools that they need to be able to meet potentially harmful behavior in a ideally constructive way. In other words, in a way that allows them to deal with the incivil person in a constructive way that the matter is resolved. But more importantly, that they don't put themselves in harm's way. Giving them the tools as to how do you end an interaction like that in a way that keeps you safe? What words do you use to increase your chances of a successful outcome? How do you put someone on notice that their behavior is inappropriate, but still giving them a chance to change to a civil tone so that they can get the outcome that they need as a voter without putting our staff in danger? And of course, if they choose not to do that, then giving them the tools and the support from senior management to terminate that interaction so they don't put themselves in harm's way. So there are a couple of big changes from last time.
Sven, I imagine you're watching what's happening in New South Wales pretty closely, as they're a month or so ahead of us in Victoria, notwithstanding that very public issue, the nomination process issue that the Liberal Party found itself dealing with. I imagine you've gone back to double check that your process is watertight if a similar situation could potentially occur here.
Yeah, we certainly have. And it is something that we look at very carefully. We have actually, over the last few years, really improved our processes of election delivery, but for both state and local, where we have very sophisticated ways of tracking all of the steps, dividing the delivery of an election into a series of work programs, making sure that those work programs interact with each other. Running an election like this, even though it is a postal election, is a huge logistical exercise. And the sequencing is absolutely crucial. And one of the sequencing issues, of course, as highlighted in New South Wales, is the mandatory statutory advertising that you have to do for crucial things like close of roll, close of nominations, and so on. And we have teams, obviously, that work on that very, very closely, but we can never take that for granted. Especially seeing as this year, of course, as most people on this webinar would be aware, we've had some changes to the timeframes. Now, we very much welcome those timeframes changes, and in fact, we've advocated for them because the timeframe was so compressed for us that the risk of election failure was actually getting unacceptably high. We've now got a timeframe that is, well, it's certainly still not easy, but gives us a much better chance of being able to run the processes that we need to do, especially when something out of your control goes wrong. So yes, we watch that in New South Wales very carefully. One of the things in New South Wales that people who have followed it may be aware that when the deadline was missed, and of course this is all in the public domain, when the deadline was missed and there was the potential of a legal challenge to the Electoral Commission, one of the big factors there was that by the time that talk was happening, the printing presses for ballot papers were already starting to roll because they have to meet statutory deadlines. You have to get those things really tightly done. Once you've got your nominations and you've done your ballot draw for order on the ballot paper, you've got to be starting to print within hours on a big scale. And we certainly have those pressures as well in Victoria. In fact, until these changes, we have the tightest timeframes in all of Australia.
I can attest to that. As we sit here doing this webinar today, this time last week, the ballot draw hadn't even happened in New South Wales. And I know people who've already received their ballot packs this week for the election. So it is a very, very tight time frame, as you say. In terms of the way people conduct themselves, the advertising, the campaigning that goes on, Sven, what are you particularly going to be on the lookout for as the VEC, as the Electoral Commission?
Yeah, look, a couple of things. One, as I said earlier, we have to be aware of where the line is for us. We don't have truth in political advertising laws in Victoria, and that's a very complex policy issue to even unpack. And I don't propose to go there now. But certainly we have a role to play if there's mis and disinformation, as I said, about the conduct of the election, how one goes about participating effectively and meaningfully, and so on. So we certainly care about that. On the sort of incivility side of things, we have very, very limited powers in that regard at the VEC. What we can still, though, do is, well, for a start, we obviously have monitoring of things like social media and so on, and where there is that kind of misinformation, we'll meet it head on. And we have arrangements with the platforms to be able to do that, including through the e-safety commissioner. Big body of work that's happened in that space between all the Australian electoral commissions and the e-safety commissioner to try and get things taken down where there is, for example, threats to our staff and so on. But we're also, in addition to all of that sort of hard stuff, and by hard I mean sort of legislative and so on, we're also just constantly trying to get the message out there of trying to appeal to the better angels of people's nature. Now, particularly interested to hear from Ian about sort of the distinction between the first two books and the third book. And I can certainly see why that's happened. But that's not going to stop us from still getting messages out there proactively to the community, to candidates, to their volunteers, and to everyone, to just say, look, let's play nice. Like, this stuff matters. We're dealing with our democracy here. We have a very good, strong, robust democracy in Australia, including in Victoria, and we're very, very fortunate to have that. But we have to keep nurturing it, and we have to keep protecting it. In the recent UK election, the UK Electoral Commissioner issued I wouldn't call it a plea, I think it was just issued a call to all participants in the election. It was particularly focused on things like AI and generated fake content and so on, to say, hey, play nice in this space. And that came from an angle where there wasn't much more that the commissioner could do, but they could still appeal to that. Now, will that appeal to the extreme fringe that is hell bent on being incivil and undermining trust? No, it won't. But it will hopefully appeal to the other 99.9% of people. And so we also see that as a tool in our toolkit.
Thanks, Sven. That's really interesting, and best of luck with the conduct of the election. I know it's getting into that really busy time now. You brought up AI there. I want to ask Andrea, in the research that you do, Andrea, is AI starting to present as more of an issue? Obviously, it hasn't been around that long, but are you seeing the trend there in your research?
Sven mentioned the UK election, and I was fortunate to be in the UK for the last 5 months on a research fellowship at Oxford University, and spent some time looking at the UK election. And there was great concern about the use of AI. And fortunately, that level of concern wasn't realised in the ways that academics and commentators and others thought that it might be. But that's not to say the threat's not coming down the line, as especially with generative AI, as it continues to get better and better, really, and more realistic. It's something we need to be really vigilant about, and it's something that everyone's really grappling with. It was kind of the number one topic across the university while I was there, across all spheres. And in journalism in particular, newsrooms are experimenting with AI. And survey work has found that in some sectors, AI is valued, such as healthcare. In journalism, it's not. It's having a negative effect on trust, as it is in anything to do with elections and political communication. So I guess it's a problem that everyone's facing across the globe, and particularly those in similar liberal democracies. But at the moment, we haven't quite seen the impact of that we're anticipating. I don't know if Sven wants to add to that.
Yeah, look, I'm happy to add a little bit to that. I mean, I was also, like you, quite pleased and even a little bit surprised that it did not rear its head more in the UK. Now, is that just a matter of time? I don't know. But one of the things that we're looking at is we've been talking to industry and other electoral commissions and so on about what is available technologically to, watermark real content and all of those sorts of things. And there's plenty of work happening in that space, but there's certainly nothing out there really that is ready to sort of, I think, address this in a very large scale, globally yet. But it may come. And of course, even if it does technologically, there is the issue of, it's a bit like fact checking. Will the people who are convinced of their beliefs even bother to do that verification when they see an image or a video that makes them feel like the way they want to feel because it confirms their beliefs? Are they going to then go and check it on a register or not? So we're trying to do a lot in terms of education, because one of the things that I think has to be part of any solution here is an informed population. Because the more informed the population is, not cynical, but informed and aware and knows some warning signs to look for, then the less impactful these things will be, even if they're technologically really good. And they are getting technologically really good. So, for example, we and our counterparts, the AEC, for example, have campaigns that focus on telling people, look out for the emotion that something creates in you when you see it. If it makes you feel angry or righteous or bilious or whatever it might be, then just take a step back and ask yourself a few questions. Like, am I being played here? Are my emotions being manipulated here? And then to say to people, there are actually places you can go. So for example, for us, anything about the election, anything about how it's conducted, who has what rights and how to exercise them, we're the source of truth for that. So if you see a video that purports to come from the VEC, well, come to the VEC website or go to our YouTube channel and get it from there. And if it's not on there, then the video you saw was probably fake. They're the kinds of things that we're trying to do. Now, yes, it's got to be that, it's got to be technological, it's got to be regulatory, but it's all got to be brought together. And frankly, it's one of those things that's never going to be done.
Okay, I might just see whether Ian wants to add anything to that before we move on to some audience Q&A. Ian, the AI factor, is that present there in Canada as well?
It is more so at other orders of government than local. And the reason, I think, well, I'm sure there are multiple reasons, but one of the more significant reasons is we have a very small incidence of political parties in local government. So a lot of it is based on individuals, and different individuals have different levels of sophistication when it comes to whatever the tool happens to be, IT or AI or anything else for that matter. So in some pockets, yes, it certainly is appearing. In most, I don't think it is appearing. However, Sven made the comment, just because it's not now doesn't mean it won't be later. So if we're not preparing for it now, we will get run over at some point in the not too distant future. And because local government elections happen quite frequently across states and provinces, it doesn't take very many iterations for us to learn, for the better and for the worse, how to use some of these tools to our own advantage. Andrea talked about, I think, some of the reason why things like misinformation and disinformation gain some level of prominence. And it's always to somebody's benefit. And Sven has potentially said, if it's not coming from us, then it's probably a fake. And there's often a reason behind why that might be a fake. And it might just be a specific local issue we're talking about. It may be something much more systemic. All of those sort of things, I think, come into play. And I think we are wise to kind of keep an eye on what's happening around the rest of the world and within our own countries, within our own states and provinces as well. So because we don't have as much in the way of parties locally, it perhaps isn't taking the same level of prominence yet, but it's certainly coming.
Thanks, Ian. And it's certainly a different level of political party involvement in our local government elections from one jurisdiction to the next as well. So I do want to encourage and remind our audience to pop their questions into the Q&A or the chat function, preferably the Q&A box, and we'll make sure we deal with as many of those as possible in the 15 or 20 minutes that we have left. I know there's one comment there about an anonymous character assassination, and that sort of feeds into a question that I was going to ask our panel about how people can protect themselves from reputational risks that come from misinformation and disinformation. And I'd like to ask you all that question. Andrea, can I perhaps start with you? How do people protect themselves?
I think being careful about, there's an old expression in survey work, and that is, if you ask a coarse question, you get a coarse response. And I think that also applies to the online world, that if you're civil in your own interactions, you're unlikely to maybe induce some of those really coarse reactions. Now, of course, it's not just up to the individual. Sometimes some very unpleasant information or people get targeted with mis and disinformation and in civil behaviour. And I think it's about at an individual level, knowing whether you want to be online, taking care of yourself online. And that might mean making a decision not to have an online presence so that people can't access you in quite the same way, in the absence of having systemic recourse through these universal codes of conduct and other types of things. But it's a difficult decision, because it means that if you're not online, you're at a disadvantage as a political candidate compared to others that might be there. But I do think it's incumbent upon us to also think about, as Sven said, being the better angels of people's nature, and, you know, practicing what we preach as well.
Sven, would you like to add to that?
Not too much for me to add, because a lot of that would sort of fall mostly into the category that's really beyond our remit as the election management body. But I do just want to sort of underline and thoroughly agree with what Andrea said towards the end there, which is that how well you interact with others can help. Now, will it help all of them, or will there be an element that's always going to attack you no matter how nice you are to them? Yeah, look, there may be. But one of the things that I see in that regard is, for example, we obviously get a lot of queries, complaints, and even very occasional compliment from members of the public to us. And we obviously have staff that are really well trained to answer those sort of queries, especially in the lead up to an election. And one of the tools in that regard is that when someone calls up and they have a belief that's clearly not based in fact, or is irrational, or worse, if our operator basically dismisses them and said, well, that's wrong, how stupid is that, you're just going to back them further into a corner. And if, on the other hand, you actually deal with them respectfully, as a fellow human being, it might be a deeply misguided fellow human being who has a potentially harmful opinion that is not based in fact, but they're still a fellow human being. If you can make it clear to them that, yes, there are certain things we simply won't tolerate because we've got to keep our staff safe. That's priority number one. But in a way that actually listens to them and deals with them in a calm, respectful manner, it's less likely to deteriorate into that sort of character assassination. That's only one small element of what you're talking about, or what the questioner is talking about, which is a much broader issue. But from our perspective, that's one angle I'd like to add.
And Ian, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I'll jump into this one as well. And to me, there's two circumstances. One is a person who is a current elected official who is subject to this sort of character assassination in the asker's words. The other then is the person who is interested in becoming an elected official and is not therefore covered by any of the structures that local government provides. So to me, the one where we have a citizen who is interested in serving on a local council, I think they are a lot more in, there's a lot less protection for them. And there is certainly, while there's a lot of things that are going on online, in our smaller communities, we still interact with each other in a physical sense. When we're out buying our weekly groceries, or when we're at the restaurant, for example, we run into people in those circumstances. We run into people in the formality of council meetings or other meetings as well. So some of this character assassination sometimes comes down to historic things that have happened between individuals going back to school days, perhaps, and those things have just festered over time and got worse and worse and worse. So when we start to think about some of the protections that we need to put in place, there's certainly the legislative protections which can be there. Whether we made reference earlier to codes of conduct for councils, we made reference for codes of conduct for people who are participating in council meetings as well, for members of the public. So having some of those rules in place, having the rules, knowing the rules and following the rules are all very important. Andrea used the term weaponization a little bit earlier too, and it's something that I'm hearing more and more. And to me, some of that becomes subjective in the way that I think in a lot of cases, things like abuse become subjective as well. That we don't, you were talking earlier saying we don't really have a good definition or a solid definition for things like misinformation or disinformation. We also don't have it here anyway, a really good definition for what are the principles of good governance that we have to abide by. The list of 10 things, the 10 commandments of good governments don't seem to exist. So when people start to get themselves into these situations where they are interested in running for office or re-upping for office or just trying to serve their communities, they're covered by a bunch of rules. People too, I think there's always an aspect of ego involved as well, because we have a battle. And the battle is hopefully is between ideas, your ideas, my ideas. Let's come up with either the best one of them or somewhere in between, and we compromise and everybody's as happy as they're going to get. But it does mean that in order for somebody to win, somebody has to lose, and now we're thrusting and parrying, and we tend to build up some of the emotion that's going on in this situation. So if we can control that with bylaws, with policies, with the formality of meetings and those sorts of things, I think there's also the ability for individuals to look out for themselves, look after themselves with therapy, with either speaking to mentors or speaking to a colleague or speaking to a counselor, to really identify why they are interested in whatever it is they happen to be interested in their life of service, and what is it that is causing them to be triggered and what they can actually do about it. Because the issue in a lot of cases in this character assassination is probably not the person, it's whatever is happening to the person, and the perception becomes the reality. And so that becomes increasingly more problematic over time. So things like having the rules in place, getting some personal help, getting some professional help, getting some collegial help, realizing you're not in this all by yourself. But it is still fundamentally an adversarial body, because we're trying to come up with the best ideas we can for the people we happen to represent.
Thanks, Ian. That's really helpful. Now, we've got a question from Peter in our Q&A that I'd like to put to you. Another information issue for local government elections, and it's about ensuring adequate information, ensuring the voters are informed in their consideration of candidates under postal voting. Peter asks, do the panellists agree that many voters vote on receipt of the ballot papers before being exposed to information publicised during the campaign, as would happen in state and federal elections with attendance voting? Who'd care to comment on that?
Oh, look, I'm happy to kick us off at the moment. I mean, for us in local government elections, it is obviously regulated by legislation, and clearly under the legislation, yes, this is postal, and what people get with their ballot paper is an information statement from each candidate. That's actually optional for the candidates, but that's what they can. That's what they will receive in their mailbox, and they can then decide based on that what they do. Now, if you sort of compare that to an attendance election, I guess it's sort of the equivalent of having the how to vote card given to you as you enter the polling or the voting center. Now, there is a fair bit of research, I think, that shows a substantial number of people pretty much make up their mind on the day, including when they walk in, which, you know, to those of us who perhaps think about it a little bit longer is a bit surprising, but it does seem to be borne out. So I'm wondering if is it actually all that different between the two? Probably what is different is that in a state election, you've got parties mostly. I mean, you have plenty of independent candidates as well, but you have parties, and a lot more people will be familiar with the general platform of a party. And then when they see their ballot paper or the how to vote card, they say, well, this is a party that I like or don't like, and vote accordingly. I suppose that, I mean, there is obviously nothing stopping a candidate or her or his supporters from campaigning. In fact, campaigning at any time, as long as they do it in accordance with the legislation, which primarily requires them to have an authorization statement on the relevant material. So that's probably what I'd say, just in terms of how it works for us primarily. But for us, obviously, as the VEC, we don't really have any discretion there. It's really as set by the legislation and decisions of, in this case, the Minister for Local Government.
Andrea, I guess the subset of this in the context of our session today is whether people are relying on misinformation or disinformation to reach their informed decision when they choose who they're going to vote for.
Well, I think returning to the original question, I don't think it's necessarily the postal ballot that's the issue here, because voting's changed in Australia in recent years in terms of broadening the guidelines for not attending on ballot day. And we saw from the 2019 election on at the federal level that most people are going to the polls before election day, and some of those are voting through postal ballots as well. So I don't think this is something necessarily that's specific to local government. Of course, as Sven said, local government doesn't tend to have the influence of political parties. It has some, but it doesn't have the types of cues that voters get at other levels of elections, where they might be voting more on a party basis rather than an individual basis, which can help guide their vote. But in a compulsory voting setting, which we have, unlike Canada, it is incumbent upon individuals to vote, which is backed up by fines if they don't, and to familiarise themselves with the candidates that are on the ballot. And I think, given the low barriers to entry, most candidates have the opportunity to have information available about themselves beyond that paragraph that Sven talked about in the political communication paperwork that comes with the ballot. They can also do it setting up their own websites and things, and it doesn't take much to Google the range of candidates that are there, or your preferred search engine, and just learn a little bit about them.
Thanks, Andrea. And Ian, from the Canadian experience, obviously different in terms of the compulsory nature, but postal attendance, is that a trend you see there?
Yeah, it definitely is. It is. And I'm trying to think, though, that not many local governments do this. It certainly is federal and provincially popular, but it's not as popular locally. So I don't know that there's any sense of anything I can comment on that actually adds a whole lot to this, other than saying that I'm sure there are a lot of people who are dyed-in-the-wool party people or personal people who have connections, who have made up their mind well before any of the voting actually happens. So it's really those people who are the undecideds, the people that show up on the day and decide who they're going to cast their vote for or against too, that some people are just happy to vote to stop somebody else as well. And maybe as we are seeing more and more stratification and greater distances between candidates in terms of philosophy, we're starting to see more about the negative option voting, the least bad rascal, than the one we are starting to see the positive voting. And I think that's kind of tragic, but I do see that growing in prominence.
The least bad rascal. I like that. Thank you, Ian. Last call for last call for questions from the audiences. We'll need to wrap this up very shortly. I noticed a conversation going on in the chat, pointing out that when we're talking about codes of conduct and respectful behaviour, that other levels of government aren't exactly setting the standard here. I know you jumped in on this conversation, Ian. Is that part of the problem, because we're not seeing it at those levels that are perhaps getting more of the attention in the media and the like?
I think it certainly is. And when so much of the actual thrust and parry within the decision makers is happening behind closed doors, and the actual legislative session becomes perfunctory or performance art, then yeah, I think that certainly does happen that way. I think words also matter. We were talking about earlier about things like the definitions of information or disinformation and misinformation. I was talking about the definition of local government. We used the term falsehoods here a few times, when in reality the word lie is so much shorter and actually gets the message across as well. So when we start to see some of these words that become a little bit mealy-mouthed, we're kind of getting away from the reality of the situation. Those rascals can get away with a whole lot more than they may otherwise have been able to get away with. And until those of us who are deeply involved in this sector become maybe more demanding of some of these cultural changes, I don't know that we're going to see a whole lot of things change, because I mentioned earlier about the definition of communities changing. And I'm quite happy that there is a community of people who are interested in literacy. There's a community who are interested in flying gliders. There's a community who are interested in Aussie rules football. There's the local reference. And and good on them, because we would like a diverse community. But those of us who have a real area of focus on the importance of local government in our lives, I think have an incumbent upon ourselves to act the role before we can actually expect others to follow us with it.
A very timely Aussie rules reference too. Thank you,
Is it?
Ian.
That's purely coincidental.
Yes. Now, just a quick one for you, Sven. Andrew was wondering in the chat whether the VEC's ever sought to determine how many voters actually do rely on the ballot pack in terms of council elections and making their decision. It's probably not something you could possibly know, is it?
No. I mean, one of the crucial things, of course, is that the ballot, both at state and local level, is completely secret. So we just can't do that. I mean, might there be a body of research that we can do in the future in that regard? There might be, but it would not be research based that we could actually base on the hard evidence of people voting as such. It would have to be based on things like surveys, questions, focus groups, those kinds of things. So which may be useful, but then we'd also have to think, well, what do we do with that information? Again, given our legislative remit, which is sort of limited in terms of getting involved in the contest of ideas between candidates, which is certainly not our place, then would we be able to do much with that? On the other hand, if we got information about what stops someone from voting at all, or what stops someone from casting a valid vote because they have trouble completing the ballot paper correctly or whatever it might be, that is a sort of information that is very useful for us. But we already do a lot of that kind of research.
We need to wrap this up. I want to ask a last question and perhaps just prompt each of the panelists for some final thoughts. But Andrea, if I can start with you, are we being overly negative here? I mean, we've still got a pretty good system, haven't we, for determining our elected representatives? Do we run the risk of throwing the baby out with the bathwater with our concerns about a lot of these issues?
Yeah, I think we always need to keep things in perspective, and we need to keep them in perspective when we talk about trust in the system as well. I mean, we want to have a degree of skepticism, but that's what makes for a robust democracy. When you look at trust surveys across nations, those at the top end of the higher trust are usually authoritarian regimes, and one of the hallmarks of a liberal democracy is that people do bring critical thinking to the way that they process information, including the way that they regard the media. So we need to keep that in perspective when we're thinking about low quality and high quality information, and not underestimate the public, that most people have a reasonable sense of, a nose for what's true and what's not true. And by providing various tools to help with that, I think is a good thing.
Thanks, Andrea. Ian, your thoughts?
I had a conversation a few months ago with a local elected official here. She was in charge of an entity we call a county, which is like a rural area. She was lamenting that she always had to take the high road. And I sensed a real frustration in her. Not that she wanted to dig into the dirt, but she was lamenting that we are fighting with one, maybe fighting is a terrible word to use too, but with one arm tied behind our backs, and that we are letting people get away with things that we shouldn't be letting people get away with. And my comment to her was, I understand that this is a difficult thing for you to do. Her CEO was part of the conversation too. I understand it's a difficult part of the difficult thing to do, but I think it's necessary. That sure, we may be being a little negative about all of this, but and I'm going to butcher this. I think it was Churchill who said that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. And I think that that's true here, particularly locally. I've stayed involved in local government because I have a passion for it, and I see like the speed of change at local government is so much faster. The things that people actually have an impact on that are happen at local, in our local order of government as well. I remember former Mayor Kim O'Keefe talking about roads, rates, and rubbish in a conversation I had with her for one of my previous books, and it really talked about the things that are important to people are the things that are dealt with local government. And the things I get upset about are to make it better, not that I'm upset about the order of government.
Kim O'Keefe, who was the Mayor of Greater Shepparton, but is now a Member of Parliament in Victoria. Thanks. Like the name dropping there, Ian. And Sven, any final thoughts from you on positivity towards our current environment?
Look, anyone who's worked with me closely for any length of time will know that I'm an incorrigible optimist. But I also, in this role, as in any big role, you have to bring a level of skepticism and in some ways pessimism to it, because you need to be able to think of all the things that can go wrong. If you're running an election, which is a incredibly complex logistical exercise, you have to think of everything that can go wrong and then prevent it from happening, or if it does happen, to correct the process and keep the election on track. In this space that we've been talking about, misinformation, disinformation, trust, and so on, the thing that despite all of that still gives me great hope and allows me to remain optimistic generally is that when I look at the people I work with here at the VEC, both the permanent workforce and the people that work with us for elections, the level of commitment, care, sense of purpose that every single one of them brings to their job every day, even on bad days, is really uplifting. And given the size of our workforce at elections, that's a pretty good representation of society. So that actually gives me the hope that, yes, we have to continue being pessimistic about a lot of these things and address them and not be complacent. That would be the worst thing for us to do. But having said all of that, when I see that and when I see this team delivering elections, it gives me so much optimism for the future that I can go home with a smile on my face.
I think that's a really good note to end on. Thank you very much, Sven. Thank you to all of our panelists today, Dr. Andrea Carson, Ian McCormack, and Sven Bluemmel. Thank you to our audience for your participation. A lot more people registered for this, and they will be waiting for the recording to be released, which will happen in a few days' time. There was one person wanted you, Andrea, to repeat your definition of mis and disinformation, but my answer to that is watch it back in the next couple of days and you'll be able to get that and watch it as many times as you like. Okay, so thank you all for what I think was a terrific discussion on the changing nature of elections. And on behalf of the VLGA, I thank you for being with us and I wish you a great afternoon or evening for you in Canada, Ian.
Thanks,
Bye for
everybody.
now.